Welcome, everyone. I'm Fred Bologna, president of CRA. Carmel Residents Association is proud to hear directly from local businessman and resident Charles Osborne about his grandfather, Sam Morse, a local legend. Charles wrote the book Boss, S.F.B. Morse, Founder of Pebble Beach, but his exploration into his grandfather's history did not end with the publication of his book. This evening, Mr. Osborne will be sharing some familiar and some newly discovered stories and pictures about his grandfather, who, by all accounts, was a Renaissance man, conservationist, athlete, artist, and entrepreneur. So let's turn the program over to Charles. The mic is yours.
All right, well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to doing this, and as soon as I figure out how to do it. Here we go. Thank you, Fred. That was very nice, and Nancy for setting this up. I'm delighted to talk to the Carmel Residents Association about my grandfather, Boss. He came to the Monterey Peninsula 106 years ago, and he made an indelible impression, I'd say. He was a classic big fish in a small pond, but he made that pond very desirable. And he, in the development of Pebble Beach and other places around the Monterey Peninsula, he was a total micromanager. He approved every single house design and every tree cut down in the 50 years he ran this place. He was an artist and a developer, and both at once. And he told me at one point in my early career that I should always have art in my life for balance. In his family, he was very stern with the boys, me included, and doted on the girls. I was raised here, right across the golf course from him on the first fairway. My old house is now a spa, and I think a venture capitalist lives in his. But I saw him often, and I was 22 when he died, and I didn't write the book until many years later, because no one else had, and I felt someone really had to do it. I did a lot of research on it. His papers are in the Stanford Green Library. He wrote 3 memoirs we found in my mother's garage. She was a great help. She died 3 years ago and had a very good mind and could remember stories and names of people. And so with that, I'll get started. Oh, one more thing. Why did I call this book Boss? Well, his friends called him Sam, and his employees, of course, called him Mr. Morse. And behind his back, or when he wasn't in the room, they called him S.F.B, but the family called him Boss. And I'll start with this is his mother, Clara Boyd, from an old Boston family. She was an artist, and she encouraged Sam to take up painting, gave him lessons and whatnot. And on the right, she was also a mother of 7 children. Sam was 5th in line with those kids and the 2nd of 2 sons. That picture on the right, they lived in Newtonville, where Sam was born, a suburb of Boston, but they had a camp up in Maine, and that's where that picture was taken. His father is on the right. His father was an interesting character, George Washington Morse. Family went in for big names. He was at Andover at high school when the Civil War broke out, and he was 15 years old, went to enlist in the Massachusetts 3rd Volunteers, was there all 4 years of the war. Out of the 800 men in his regiment, he was one of 67 who survived. He was wounded twice, captured twice, and went back and came out a lieutenant. He started probably as just a camp aide. He was a brevet captain. That's his father. And his father, there's a picture of him at Maine, and on the right, where he's showing off his splendid stomach. He was on a trip to Marseille. He died on that trip when Sam was just barely 20 years old. This is Sam at Andover. His mother said, "You're too slight to play football." So he spent the rest of his life making sure that no one would ever call him slight again. He graduated from Andover and went to Yale. That's him second from the left of those four guys. And as you can see, he did build himself up. He is not holding his stomach in. He was kind of known as a brawler in his time. And I don't know if you can see that cartoon on the left done by a friend of his. It says, "Come on, fellas, I'll put the hooks to every damn one of you. S.F.B. Morse." He kind of didn't mind he took boxing there at Yale and played football. He was the captain of the team in his final year. He was voted most popular. And you'll see in that newspaper thing, college football, especially Harvard and Yale, were very big deals all across the United States at that time. And it was a rough sport. 16 young men died in 1906, the year this picture was taken, playing football. Sam was actually kicked out of that game for a rough hit on the Harvard captain. The next day, the Harvard captain said it wasn't a bad hit, it was legal. And they remained friends all their lives. This is Sam's wedding. He got married right after graduation to Ann Thompson. There was a prize for the first man to get married, and he won that prize of $500, which was a reasonable amount of money. Not that he was, I'm sure that wasn't why he did it right away, but he was a competitive type. There was a very wealthy professor at Yale called John Hayes Hammond, and he offered Sam a job either in Rhodesia, or Zimbabwe now, where he had mining interests, or in California, where he was developing property. Sam, of course, took California, and the property turned out to be in Delano. Now, no slander on Delano, but it is though on the beach and have palm trees there. That didn't work out, and Sam next went up to see some friends in San Francisco, and the Crocker family, who were the boys were at Yale with him, and the father, W.H. Crocker, was in charge of the Pacific Improvement Company, which was the Big Four holding company. The Big Four were Huntington, Hopkins, Stanford, and Crocker. And Crocker was the only one that had natural children. He had several, and they had several, and that's the only family of those Big Four that stayed in California. This is on Crocker's ranch, which he put Morse in charge of after a brief interview and a visit there. 65,000 acres in Merced. They had oil, cattle. They started an irrigation company called the Merced Irrigation Company, which is still going today. And Sam loved it. He loved being out in the wild like that. And he loved being in charge of a lot of people. And it was really his early heyday. His wife, Ann, did not like it at all. And they were having problems in their marriage. And soon after he left the Merced, they were divorced. This is Crocker in the middle. And then those are the other heirs of the Big Four. The fancy looking fellow on the left is Francis Searles. He was a decorator from New York City who was helping Mrs. Hopkins, who was 25 years his senior, but they got married and she cut out Timothy Hopkins from the will and left everything to Mr. Searles, who ended up buying Hopkins' interests. Jane Stanford in the upper right was busy with her university. And so basically, Crocker was in charge of getting rid of all of the holdings of what they call the Pacific Improvement Company, or the holdings that were non-railroad related. The most important part of this was in the Monterey. And Sam was on a mission. His mission was to go down there, fix up the hotel and the other properties around, and then sell them. He did fix them up. He used the money from the Big Four to build a dam and created the water company, Monterey Water Works, now owned by Cal-Am. They also owned almost all of Pacific Grove, and they had been developing that after Crocker bought it from David Jacks, and all of Pebble Beach, which is called Del Monte Park at the time. So Sam, that was his job, fix it up, sell it. So he did the fix it up part, but he didn't sell it, he bought it. And that was 1919. It was $1.3 million, and this included Pebble Beach, of course, which was what he was really after. And it was also a problem because they'd started developing it, and they had all these little lots all along the ocean front. Sam had every map of that subdivision destroyed, and he totally rebuilt it. That's now the 6th through the 14th holes. I think there's 10 houses on the front of fronting those holes. He didn't have the money to buy it, so he went to Crocker, and Crocker said, "I'm not going to loan you the money." And so that was pretty disturbing to Sam because he thought Crocker was going to help him. But he found this guy, Herbert Fleischacker, who agreed to come in and form a group, and they bought the property from Crocker. And the group that had made an offer on it wanted Sam to be the manager, but Sam didn't want to be the manager. Fleischacker was his friend for life, even though Fleischacker had a problem in the 30s and went bankrupt. He turned out he'd done some emoluments that he shouldn't have, and he got kicked out of the bank and a disgrace to his family, but Sam kept him on the board. The first thing he had to do was to start selling lots, because $1.3 million was a lot of money. He put Carmel Valley up for sale, all 12,000 acres of it that came with the purchase, at $150 an acre, but no one wanted it. So he broke it up into 12 lots. He kept one that had the dam on it, the San Clemente Dam, for the waterworks, and he sold the other 11, one to Helen Crocker Russell for the Double H Ranch, now Stone Pine, sold another to Porter Marquard, and then other groups bought different parts. And a few years later, he bought back, in 1924, he bought back 500 acres. So my grandmother had a place to get out of the fog of Pebble Beach. These two people here were his top salespeople. The woman in the middle with a nice smile was Marion Hollins. She was a fabulous athlete, and boss gave her the position of athletic director for the Del Monte. She was the women's amateur champion, golf champion in 1920, and the only woman to play on a professional polo team. She was very accomplished. And she was his top salesperson. She came from a wealthy family and knew a lot of people back east who wanted something out here. And she did very well. The gentleman on the right was Harrison Godwin, who later owned the Pine Inn, but he was the number 2 salesman. And when Marion Hollins was off doing other things, he was number 1. He's a great salesman and very good golfer. And I'm sure a good drinking buddy with Sam. This is one of the Crocker mansions that were built right in the 20s. 20s was a great building boom. Now, Templeton Crocker and his wife, Helene Irwin, started the construction, and Crocker picked the design of a Byzantine monastery with travertine stone. And it was nicknamed the Marble Palace because of all the marble in it. Now, on the left there, you see a bathtub that was carved out of a solid block of black marble. It had gold fixtures. It was quite the thing. And that's another Carmel character looking at my mother dressed as an Indian. That's Bud Allen, who owned the La Playa Hotel later on. They were good friends. And I'm sure the picture was totally staged. Now, polo was a big deal in the 20s, and these are the wives of various polo players at the time. That's my grandmother, who married S.F.B in 1919, Relda on the far left. And that's a lot of her pictures. She looks kind of grim, but she was a very jolly, fun person. I didn't know her. She died when I was very young. This is Relda again. And Sam bought a beautiful yacht, the Temptress, 81-foot schooner. And he sailed it to Tahiti. This is obviously not Tahiti, but Pebble Beach. And the women are all settled in there. I learned the dog's name that Relda's holding, but if you can see the dog, that I've forgotten at this moment. But it's a beautiful boat and had a great time. Frank McComas came with him. That's Jean Francis McComas next to Relda, and her other friends. That's the Temptress and S.F.B at the helm. They had a full crew, including a radio man, which there's an Italian guy, and he got so seasick, they never used the radio, but they were gone for 2 months. Life was better back then. In Carmel, Sam had joined the local baseball league, the Abalone League. He was with the Shamrocks, and this was out of an early issue of the Pinecone. He's probably 50, in his early 50s when this picture is taken, but he was a very good athlete. And I don't know if he was the Babe Ruth level, but he did enjoy it. Joe Mora was also on that. Joe was a very good friend of his, the sculptor, painter, illustrationist, and his brother-in-law, Byington Ford, who had also bought one of those parcels out in Carmel Valley. He built an airport out there and started did the first commercial strip in the village. And very important to him was have the stirrup cup bar there, or the running iron. This was on the ranch that Sam bought in 1924 and built the houses there. These are his children. On the left is Jack, John Boyd Morse, who was president of the company at one point, and then quit to become an artist. He was at Yale. Next to him is on the coming left to right is Nancy, who spent her last years here in Carmel. And Sam in the middle, my mother Mary, and Sam's oldest son, Sam Jr. Sam unfortunately died in 1951, the same year my grandmother Relda did. On the ranch, Sam became a real cowboy again. This is his favorite horse, Moonlight. Now, he liked to say, "I love that horse like no other." From the day he was a colt to the day I shot him. That was the way that cowboys would take care of ailing, sick horses in their elder years. This is my mother. She became a very good golfer. They lived on the 18th fairway at Pebble Beach, right off the lodge. And she had to hit 100 golf balls a day. And she had her governess, Madame Dumont, would sit there in a chair knitting while Mary used the 18th fairway as a practice fairway. She held the record at Pebble Beach and Cypress Point and Stanford, where she went to school for some time. But the minute she got out of her father's grasp, she stopped playing golf and never played again. She did for one day, actually, several years later, when Eisenhower was in town. They played then. She was asked to be the first woman to play at Bing Crosby, but she declined. This was a magazine article in Fortune magazine, and I can't really see it. In the left, everything shaded was what Del Monte controlled. Not all of Pacific Grove, but a good chunk of it. There was, in all of Pebble Beach, and a piece of Carmel Woods. And Boss had, in the 30s, had bought out the final holding of the Jacks family, the Rancho Aguajito. And he'd also bought out his old partner, Herb Fleischacker's interest in the company. And I can't really read. Maybe I can move these boxes over a little bit, but yes. This was what they said. Samuel F.B. Morse, he really did not like it. He liked to be S.F.B. or Sam. isn't kidding himself much. He knows that the fabulous real estate days of the 20s probably will never be repeated. The highest price he ever got for choice near waterfront land was $6,000 an acre. And altogether, he'd never get that much again. All the good property's gone. The shot down below, Mike Canning has got a lot there for sale for $24 million. So much for Fortune magazine's prediction ability. I put this slide in. I don't know what was going on there. That's Frank McComas in the middle, and Relda on the left, and Sam and Frank seem to be enjoying something, and Relda's tolerating it. I mentioned this slide because Frank McComas, who was a very famous artist in his time in the 20s, and then faded slowly into obscurity. There's a show today on the at the museum, Monterey Museum of Art. I think it's up there for another week. And if you get a chance, you should go see that, because it really was a fabulous, he was a fabulous painter and a very good friend of my grandfather's. Okay, famous people. That's Ginger Rogers there at the ranch, showing her moves with my grandfather lassoing her. Joe DiMaggio. He wasn't really a friend of Boss, but I am a baseball fan, so I like that. These couple, I don't know what that's Jean Harlow and William Powell, and they asked to stay at the ranch for a week because they weren't married and no one knew that they were having an affair. And my mother said they barely came out of the bedroom, except in the morning. Jean Harlow took her up to the farm part of the ranch and taught her how to milk a cow. Apparently Harlow grew up on a farm and loved farm animals. In the middle pictures, they're on a hayride. That's my mother gladdening it up. She must have been 14 at the time. And Harlow, you can just see her with that little bushy head of blonde hair. She died just 2 years after this, at the age 26. Sadly, it's a liver failure, I think. And that on the right is Babe Zaharias, the great golfer. Now, right at before we got into the war in June of 41, Salvador Dali was staying at the Hotel Del Monte, and Boss's PR guy, Herb Serwin, got to him and said, you know, we'd love to put on a party, raise some money for the needy artists of Europe during the war. Dali, of course, bit, and he designed the ballet room in the hotel into a surrealist forest. And local artist Bruce Harris did all the work, and including all the gunny bags from the ceiling and the waiters in costume. There were a lot of celebrities and very wealthy people there. It was a total sellout at $500 a head. They didn't make any money because it was such an expensive production. Dali sat at the end. You can barely see it there in that picture, in a big chair that looked like a bed. And those were his costumes. And that's Dali's wife, Gala, who loved it and loved the spotlight. And Dali had also designed a wrecked automobile with a new model inside, and that's on the lower right. Eris found a model to do it and gave her a lot of sleeping pills, and then worried, so she'd sleep during the whole thing, worried if the place caught on fire, how he'd get her out of there. My mother sat right at the end of the table there, and she said it was very irritating. People kept bumping into her trying to look at the nude model. And then after the war, things picked up again. Bing Crosby bought his golf tournament here. That's Bing on the right with Ed Sullivan, and who's admiring my father and grandfather's physique. And the cartoon done by Hank Catcham on the left. Basically, it's without Sam Morse, Pebble Beach would be a West Coast Coney Island, says Bing Crosby. And Sam Morse says without Bing Crosby, Pebble Beach would still be an unknown paradise. And this jolly looking gal is Flora Woods, the Madam of Cannery Row, made famous in Steinbeck's book of that name. She called up my grandfather, and I got this from his memoirs. She called him up and said, Mr. Morse, the state is going to take away my liquor license. Now, I can't have an operation without a liquor license. you know, my girls are providing a service here. If it wasn't for them, those guys over in Fort Ord and the cannery workers, they'd be all after your local girls. And my grandfather said, well, Flora, I don't know what I can do, but I'll make a few calls. Well, Earl Warren was the governor of California at the time and a friend of Boss's. Sam called him up and he explained the situation. And Warren said, well, I don't know what I can do, Sam, but I'll make a few calls. 2 weeks later, Flora called back and said, I don't know what you did, Mr. Morse, but they're letting me keep my liquor license. I told that story to Earl Warren's granddaughter, and she seemed to find it amusing, but not shocking. Eisenhower, this is the only other time my mother played golf. It was in Tucson with Bud Allen after Ike and S.F.B. played at Cypress. Ike was a better golfer, but after they finished a round, they went out to the Carmel Mission and painted in the afternoon. My grandfather was a better painter. I mentioned he had to prove every tree cut down. I don't know if it was during this round with Ike, but he would usually hit a big hook, and he'd always hook into these cypress trees on the 14th fairway. And finally got fed up with it. This was when the company had taken over the running Cypress Point because Cypress Point was going bankrupt. And he had those suspending trees cut down. There's still a gap between the first fairway and the 14th. He painted all his life, painted and exercised. He liked to travel a lot. This actually wasn't the painting that's displayed on that easel. My sister Ellen and I decided that it was the painting, we didn't like it much, so we photoshopped another one of his in the cypress tree. But it is his drawing. In 52, he married Maureen Church, later Maureen Church Coburn, a great benefactress of the hospital. Sam gave him the 22 acres of land to put the chomp on, and she endowed the nursing program at NPC, and also started the art program. And if any of you have ever been so unfortunate as to go to Chomp, you'll see one of the joys of it is that the art collected there is really very good. I'm the guy in the short pants. That's my sister Susan next to me, and the little girl with her deer in the headlight stare is Sister Polly. They got married in our house, and they lived for the next 18 years together, very happily. On the right is Boss out on the ranch. As I said, he was stern with the boys in the family. You can see from his look, he's kind of saying, no, France out of mine should be a clown. He considered himself a very good cook. This picture on the left is taken from a Sports Illustrated article called Sam Morse Makes a Rarebit, which I guess is like fondue. And on the right is him barbecuing at the ranch, that same barbecue that Gene Harlow and William Powell were at. And it's still there. It's the first thing he built at the ranch was a barbecue. He was, I love this quote because it was at a 1965 ceremony honoring S.F.B. and Jack Morse gave a talk and he said, Sam Morse was an artist who spent a lifetime painting a 20,000 acre canvas. Now, before I close, I want to say that tomorrow would be my father's 100th birthday. He worked for, and I want to just kind of wish him a happy birthday. He married my mother in 1943 in New York while he was on leave from the Navy. 4 years later, he joined the Del Monte Properties Company, running a country club, and later became the president of the company. Here he is, later time with S.F.B, cutting the ribbon on the new pier with Mark Raggett and Mr. Jenkins, the boss's nemesis on the fifth hole, and local artist Danny Garcia. So with that, I'll conclude and open up for any questions or comments or whatever you've got.
Great. Thanks so much, Charles. This is super stuff. As a neighboring town to our Carmel by the Sea, can you give more insights as to S.F.B's, passion for nature and maybe how he mapped out the golf courses and how they rolled out over time? A little bit more about the land use aspects. What can you offer as color commentary?
Yeah. He was very adamant about protecting the coastline. And in his time, no houses, except for that were built along most of the coast, like 95% of the coast that he controlled, there were no houses on. That's why he wanted the golf courses there, so that it would protect the shoreline. And also so that people up on the hill wouldn't have their view obstructed. The Crocker mansion were there already as he was moving in. Besides, he wasn't going to say no to them. But otherwise, he didn't allow anything built along the coast. And he just loved the place. I mean, he was there for 4 years before he bought it. And he spent a lot of time riding around, looking at stuff. I mean, Pebble Beach was kind of a mess at the time. A lot of swampland and sand dunes. And it really was, David Jacks wouldn't touch it much, although he owned most of it. And there was a Chinese fishing village where the Beach Club is now. So he had a great feel for it, and he had an artist sense how to develop it. Skip Lloyd, once before I wrote this, asked me, "I know what your grandfather did, but why?" And I think it's that he was the artist. He would control how this was developed, like an artist would want to finish his painting and not have someone else come in and do it.
Great. So what about the rollout of the different golf courses? How did that happen, over time? And, which came first?
Well, first was Pebble Beach. Well, the Del Monte course was there. And, but in Pebble Beach course first opened in 1919. He had laid it out with the help of some of his artist friends. And they just basically just blocked out this big chunk of land and said, we'll put the golf course there and have all those beautiful holes along the ocean. Then in the 20s, the country club course was built, the first country club course, the MPCC course. And again, it was laid out, the company owned it at the time. And it was laid out with houses set off the course, back away from the course, with forest in between them. Then the second course was the same kind of layout. With MPC, that was my father's first job, was the country club, and the company wanted to sell it to the members, but the members didn't want to buy it. The dues were only like $1.50 a month, and if they owned it, they'd have to take over all the expenses. So Sam made a deal that he built the second course, give him the money for a second course, if they would please take the country club off his hands. So they did. And then the third course built was Cypress Point. It was soon after the country club course, the first course was built. And this was Marion Holland's idea. Sam took credit, but basically it was Holland's idea. She said, you want a club that's basically restricted and make it hard to join, and it certainly is. And so they blocked out some land over in that, on the Cypress Point area. And Alistair McKenzie was the architect, but he also listened to Frank McComas and Marion Hollins. Marion Hollins actually picked the 16th, the famous 16th hole at Cypress. And they were talking about how it would make it a par 4 and go over there. And she said, nope. And she dropped the ball on the ground, took out probably a 3-iron and smacked it over the bay there and said, put the hole right there. And they did. So she was instrumental in that. And then after that came the next, the shore course at the country club. And later on, Poppy Hills and Spyglass. Actually, I like to take credit for designing Spyglass, although it's given to a much more famous architect, because I took a map into my grandfather's office and I said, this would be a good place for a golf course, right next to Indian Village. And he said, mm-hmm. And next thing I know, they had a famous golf architect design it and lay it out, but it was my idea, so I'm taking total credit.
Excellent. Great. So let's peck away at some more of these submitted questions. This is, what would the boss think of Pebble Beach today if he were still alive?
Yeah, he'd like it that what he'd really like is how good they are with their employees. And he was loyal to his employees. And if you talk to really anyone who works there, they like that. He would not like some of the houses that have been along the coast, especially that monstrosity on Stillwater Cove that was built a few years ago. And I don't think he'd go for the living next door to those condos that the company recently built on the first fairway. But otherwise, they've done a very good job. And they got around Mr. Jenkins's will, which said you can't sell my property to the Pebble Beach Company, by having Charles Schwab and Les Vogel buy it and then rerouting the fifth fairway. He'd love that. And, you know, there's a lot of building there. They've preserved a lot of the forest, and that's what he loved, was that wide open forest with the horse trails through it. And a lot of that's still there.
Yeah, great. So let's see, what this next one is. Any insights you can provide on the development of Carmel Woods and preference for Mediterranean style homes as a topic?
Yeah, he liked it because there were log cabins. There were some log cabins in Pebble Beach, and he didn't like that idea at all. He liked the Spanish era. He really wanted to emphasize the Spanish. You know, we even had the coat of arms of the Count of Monterey, or the Duke. His coat of arms there. The Duke came out, Duke of Alba came out in the 20s and saw his coat of arms there. It was a little miffed about that, but they got along and they let him keep the coat of arms up. But he loved the Spanish era, and he really wanted to emphasize that. So he wanted the Mediterranean style homes. Carmel Woods was a different thing. That was developed later on. And, you know, it's part of Carmel. It wasn't part of the forest of Pebble Beach. And he had a lot of help from Joe Mora there in terms of just laying it out. And of course, Mora did that statue of Sarah that I think is in storage somewhere. Right. But, and I went to Junipero Serra School, so I want that statue back.
We all do. Yep.
It's nicely laid out, and it's different than the way Devendorf Powers laid out the Carmel in the grid. It kind of works with the land, and that would be his what he'd like to have done.
So, any more insights or comments on the relationship with Joe Mora that come to mind?
I think it was Perry Newberry offered Joe Mora a lot to build a house on, and Sam offered him a better lot in Pebble Beach. Sam won out. They were very good friends, and they'd go riding together. The last statue that Mora made was of Sam Morse, and actually I have it here in my office. And I'll show that in a minute. Talk to my assistant into getting it. She's also known as my wife. But you just make a good gesture.
Super.
But we were good buddies. The statue on the bottom is engraved to my pal Sam Morse, and I don't know if you can see that well, but it's in his cowboy days, and he's got his cowboy hat.
Great.
They were good buddies. Weighs a ton. Thank you, Karen.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. So is it true that JFK almost had a hole-in-one at Cypress, but begged for not to go in so people would not think he was a golfer, which was more associated with Republicans?
Yeah, well, I heard that story, but I did hear another story about that day when he was president-elect, that he had come up with, and I heard the story from Sammy, who was the maitre d' of the Cypress Point Club at the time, and he said that Mr. Kennedy had come up and he had spikes on, and Sammy told him, well, you can't come into the clubhouse with spikes on, and so Kennedy took off his shoes and started going in stocking feet, and Sammy stopped him again and said, well, you've got to have some shoes. I'm sure we have some here for you in the clubhouse. And later I heard that story, and then I asked Sammy one day, I said, is that true? And he said, yes, well, you know, we have a lot of Republican members. But I've heard that story about that he didn't want people to know that he played golf, but I mean, he was from a wealthy family. And
just a little, you bet. So has the Pebble Beach proper been always a gated community? Did that start off that way, and it's been that way?
It was part of the hotel as a private park, and there were gates. I have a picture somewhere of it, but you can see there was always a charge for doing it, or you had to be a guest of the hotel. And they take car rides through there, or you could ride horses through there. It was always gated. And my grandfather told me once it was great, you know, because that took care of the roads. That all the income from those, from the tolls and the badges that they sold used to go just for maintaining the roads.
So what role did Sam play in Highway 68 West? So was there a connection in? Yes,
he didn't want
to.
But Holman, who had a big department store in Pacific Grove, wanted that because he was afraid that if another war broke out, that they would close the access, that the Presidio would close access, and they'd become landlocked there, and people couldn't get in and out. So what he wanted to do was to have access through Pebble Beach to, you know, just along the drive or one through there. And Sam didn't like that idea. He didn't want extra traffic there. And the politicians paid more attention to Sam than they did Holman at the time. And Holman went on a campaign, and they finally worked out a compromise where they could go through the upper part of Pebble Beach there. And that's how, but Sam was adamant against opening up the gates. So that was his part, and, you know, went on his land. I'm sure he charged them for it. But
$1.95 or something like that, you know, whatever. So is it true that the boss lost the land that became the new Pebble Beach Golf Links 5th hole to Mr. Jenkins in a card game?
No.
Who knows their stuff? Asking that one.
I like it. He wasn't that kind of gambler. I mean, he wouldn't do that. He did. There is one golf story where he built the golf course, 9-holer in Pacific Grove, the city course, and then gave it to the city for a $10 gold piece, with a stipulation that they had to water it and maintain it for 5 years, which they did. But I like that, selling the golf course for $10. Now, he and Jenkins didn't get along, but I don't think it's because Jenkins got the land from him. I've never heard that story.
Yeah. If your grandfather didn't build Pebble Beach, what do you think he would have done? He's obviously involved in real estate. Do you have any guesses of his other passions that might have led him down a different path?
It was being real estate, because he, after the time with Hammonds and on Crocker's land, he just had a good feel for it. They did offer him a job of developing the Hope Ranch down in Santa Barbara, but he'd already started with Del Monte, and he didn't want to leave. But it would have been in real estate. Maybe become a good painter and did that.
Cool. Cool. And what do you think your grandfather's opinion of your book would be?
Oh, he'd find errors. He was a very critical guy when it came to his family. I mean, he doted on my mother. His other 3 children grew up in Chicago, when Ann left him. But he was always critical and always giving advice. He told me once that when I got married, I was a senior in college. He said, "You got to have a job first before you get married." But he sent a nice check along with that letter. And then in researching this book, I found out that he got married in college and didn't have a job. But he did get that $500 check.
So was he an affectionate person, even though he was critical?
Yes. Not, I mean, he was very formal with me. He was, I'd see him all the time. I mean, they'd run into him at the gas station or the barber shop. And, it was a case of speak when spoken to. He was a very formal guy. I mean, not with his pals or his buddies or women, but with his family, he was very formal. And I think that's because a lot came from his father, who was, that horrible time in the 4 years in war, age 15 to 19. He was apparently a very stern father to all his children. So I was probably carrying that.
So he was of an older age set, so wasn't directly impacted by World War II, but had to ride the waves of the economic impact and the like of it, or any.
He volunteered for World War I, but they turned him down because of medical problems that he had. He looked terribly fit, but he had gone to Mexico while he was on the Crocker Ranch and got anemic dysentery and had a couple of other problems that he got down there. So they wouldn't take him in. But by World War II, he was 60-something years old.
Yeah. So yeah. And so, how did Pebble Beach get its name?
Well, there was a beach there. There was Pebble Beach, and even though it's pure sand now, somehow it got that name. It was just part of the Del Monte Park. And I think I've heard Neil Hotel ideas. He's probably better on this. He's such a great historian.
Oh, good. And who is Virginia Morse?
That was Jack Morse's second wife. She was an artist like Jack, and when Jack left the company, he was a big drinker, Jack, and he joined AA, and he met Virginia there, and Jack took up painting, and the two of them had just a wonderful life together. And some of her children from relatives were married one of my cousins. How's it go? Is it Sam Jr. had a son named Sam, the third, and he married one of Virginia's nieces, and Anne, and they produced some wonderful children, Holly and Molly Morse. And his cousin Rick Morse just passed away. He also had some children. But Sammy lives down in Arizona. I see him when he decides to come up.
Great. All right, so let's wrap it up here with one last one. It says, what do you think he was the most proud of, and what do you think he might have regretted?
First thing, with regret, he was kind of a teacher in many ways, although he was having lots of people working for him even during the Depression, putting on a show. He got some sheep to do instead of gardeners to cut the fairways, and that was clearly a big mistake. He also wanted to harvest the guano on the rocks at Pescadero. That was also a big mistake. He was not a guy that reflected much on what he did right and what he did wrong. He's definitely the proudest of the legacy that he left. The oceanfront protected, the forests that are still there. And that's what he'd be proudest of.
Indeed. Yeah. It's quite a gorgeous setting, and it's neat to see it pretty well preserved. You know, we've got a lot of that here in Carmel by the Sea as well. So it's great that we all get to share in that effort. All right, so that's it for the questions. Fred, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Well, thanks everyone for the great questions, and especially thanks to Charles for all the wonderful next door to Carmel pictures and stories you shared about your grandfather. Sam was quite a visionary and someone that has enriched the whole Monterey Peninsula, no doubt. Thanks again, Charles.
Great pleasure.
And here are a few CRA reminders. Our Carmel Citizen of the Year celebration and gathering is traditionally every 2 years in early spring. But with the current health restrictions, this event is now rescheduled for Sunday, October 10th. Our next CRA program is routinely our members-only annual meeting and spaghetti feed in May. And in these pandemic times, we are still exploring various options on how best to engage with this annual update. In any case, we hope that with the increasing access to vaccination, we look forward to gathering in person again in months to come. So watch this space. Finally, to enjoy more of our programs and benefits and to attend members-only events and receive our CRA email invitations, newsletters, and printed newsletter, The Voice, we welcome you to join us officially at www.carm.carmelresidence.org. So on behalf of CRA Board, we wish you all health and safety, plus a happy Easter and Passover in the coming days. Good evening and good night.
Thanks, everybody.